8 Navy SEALs, 30 enemy fighters, a valley that should have been clear. It wasn't. The moment Lieutenant Commander Ethan Walker's team stepped into Keros Ridge, the mountainsides exploded with gunfire, machine guns from positions that weren't supposed to exist, RPG teams that had been waiting, like they'd been given a reservation. This wasn't an ambush. Someone had sold them. Pinned inside a crumbling compound with wounded men and a radio going nowhere, Ethan had 60 seconds to figure out who was going to die first. Then a rifle cracked from the mountain above, and everything changed. If you're new here, subscribe now. Hit that bell. Drop your city country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story travels. You don't want to miss what comes next. The briefing had lasted 40 minutes. Ethan Walker stood at the back of the TOC, Tactical Operations Center, with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between the map projected on the far wall and the faces of the men reading it. 8 men, his men. He knew every one of them by the way they breathed when they were nervous, and right now, none of them looked nervous. That should have been a comfort. It wasn't. Keros Ridge, Captain Dennis Holt tapped the projected satellite image with a laser pointer, his voice flat and practiced. Valley floor sits at roughly 2,000 meters. The compound here, the red dot circled a cluster of mud brick structures, is where Humint places the target. Khalid Rahimi, mid-level logistics coordinator. He's been routing weapons and cash to 3 separate cells operating out of the eastern province. How solid is the intel? Ethan asked. Holt didn't look at him. Solid enough. That's not a number. It's been corroborated by 2 independent sources in the last 72 hours. Holt clicked to the next slide. Elevation profiles, approach vectors, a grid overlaid on the mountain terrain. We have Overwatch positioned on the high ground before you insert. Army sniper team, Staff Sergeant Collins and Specialist Reed. They'll be eyes on from approximately here. The dot moved northwest, up the slope, to a ridgeline that commanded the entire valley floor. You'll have radio contact. They'll call anything that moves. Ethan studied the ridgeline position. It was good ground, steep approach, natural rock cover, a field of view that covered both the compound and the main valley access routes. Rules of engagement? Standard. Minimize collateral. Rahimi is priority capture, but command understands the operational environment. The briefing continued. Routes, timings, contingencies. Ethan listened to all of it and asked 2 more questions, about the helicopter extraction window and about the nearest QRF. And Holt answered both with the same practiced confidence. When the room cleared, Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb fell into step beside Ethan in the corridor. You look like somebody pissed in your coffee, Webb said. Mission feels packaged. Webb glanced at him sideways. Packaged how? Every answer already had an answer. Ethan kept walking. Nobody pushed back on the routes. Nobody asked about secondary extraction. It felt like a presentation, not a planning session. Or it's just a straightforward snatch and grab and you've been doing this too long. Ethan didn't respond to that. Webb wasn't wrong. 18 months of deployments, 11 direct action missions, and the thing that kept him sharp was the same thing that made him difficult to work with. He didn't trust clean. Nothing in this part of the world stayed clean. They inserted at 0200, 4-vehicle convoy to the drop point, then a 3-kilometer foot movement through broken terrain in full darkness. No lights, night vision monoculars. Each man carrying his own weight and kit, rifle, sidearm, body armor, medical, comms, ammunition. Ethan carried an additional radio for the Overwatch net. The valley floor was cold and still. Rocks and scrub, and the occasional loose shale that shifted under boots in ways that sounded, in the silence, like small explosions. The team moved in patrol formation, point element forward, main body staggered, rear security rotating every 100 meters. Webb was directly behind Ethan. Petty Officer First Class Jordan Reese held point, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had learned the hard way that speed and survival rarely agreed. At the 2-kilometer mark, Ethan keyed his radio. Shadow 6, this is Hammer Actual. Radio check. Static. He waited 5 seconds. Tried again. Shadow 6, Hammer Actual. How copy? Nothing. He looked at Webb, who was already frowning at his own handset. Webb shook his head. Could be terrain interference. The ridgelines in this valley were steep enough to kill radio signal. Could be equipment issue. Could be the Overwatch team was in a noise discipline phase, waiting until they had something worth reporting. Could be a lot of things. Ethan filed it and kept moving. He'd try again at the 1 kilometer mark. Reese raised a fist from the front of the formation. Everyone stopped. 30 seconds of nothing. Ethan watched the darkness ahead, letting his eyes do what they'd been trained to do. Not focus on any single point, but scan in slow lateral movements, looking for shapes that didn't belong. Rocks didn't move. Wind-bent scrub moved in patterns. Humans, even when they were trying not to, broke patterns. Reese lowered his fist and made a slow, rotating gesture. Resume. The team moved forward. At the 1 kilometer mark, Ethan tried the radio again. Still nothing from Shadow 6. He made a decision he knew he'd either defend or regret. They continued to the objective. The compound appeared exactly where the satellite imagery had placed it. A ragged collection of mud brick walls and corrugated metal roofing in the northwest corner of the valley floor, built against the base of a slope that rose sharply behind it. A single exterior light burned above a doorway. No visible sentries from their current position. Ethan crouched behind a boulder 40 meters from the compound wall and ran his eyes along the structure. Something was wrong. He couldn't quantify it. The building looked right. The light was where it was supposed to be. The approach route was clear. But 18 months of doing this had built a kind of environmental instinct, a low-frequency alarm system that operated below conscious thought. And right now it was going off. He keyed Webb on the team channel. "You feel that?" "Yeah," Webb said. And that was all. Reese was already looking at Ethan, waiting. So were the other 6 men, petty officers, Garza and Tran from the assault element, Lieutenant Kowalski and his partner Chen from the support position, and the 2 newest members of the team, Diaz and Park, who had the medical kit and the secondary communications. 8 men looking at 1 man for a decision. Ethan gave the signal to advance. They breached the compound wall through a gap in the north face, moving in pairs, stack formation, weapons up, and scanning. The interior was a central courtyard with 3 rooms leading off the main axis. Old ammunition crates against one wall. A vehicle chassis without wheels. A fire pit, cold, with ash that was hours old. Clear, clear. The 3rd room's door was closed. Ethan stacked on the right side of it, Webb on the left. He held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. Webb pushed the door. Empty. An empty room with an empty floor, and, on the far wall, a single piece of fabric, a cloth cut roughly, tied around a nail at head height. Ethan stared at it. The cloth was green and red, a marker. His radio crackled. Not main handset, the secondary one. A burst of static, and then a voice, heavily distorted, just 3 words. "Get out, now!" The roof exploded. 3 things happened in the first 2 seconds. The corrugated metal above the central courtyard tore open under the impact of a PKM machine gun firing from an elevated position on the slope behind the compound. The rounds walked a line across the courtyard floor, and Garza, who had been in the open, went down hard, catching a ricochet off the flagstone that shredded his left thigh. Simultaneously, the compound's exterior walls became a problem. In a way, walls weren't supposed to be, which was to say the wall to the south simply opened, not breached, opened like a door on hinges, and 4 fighters poured through wearing chest rigs and moving with organized, practiced intent. And from somewhere high on the ridgeline to the north, a rocket-propelled grenade detonated against the boulder that Reese had been using as cover 30 seconds earlier. He'd moved. The boulder didn't survive the greeting. Ethan was on the floor of the 3rd room before conscious thought caught up. "Contact northeast and elevated." Webb's voice, sharp and controlled. The voice of a man who had been through the version of this that didn't have survivors. Ethan was already moving. He dragged Garza backward through the doorway by the drag handle on his body armor while rounds chipped the flagstones and threw grit into his eyes. Garza was conscious. He was cursing in Spanish, which meant he wasn't dying yet. "Park! Garza has a leg wound. Left thigh. Get eyes on it." Park was already moving. Ethan got to the east wall and pressed his back against it. Through the gap in the north face they'd breached through, he could see the valley floor. And the valley floor was full of people. Not 4 fighters, not 8. More. Many more. Moving in from multiple directions with deliberate spacing, using the boulders and terrain features as cover, advancing toward the compound in a pattern that wasn't the frantic charge of irregulars who'd spotted an enemy patrol. It was a tactical bound. They were trained. Webb. I see it. How many? A pause. A lot. The next 12 minutes were the kind of 12 minutes that rewrote a person. Ethan's team consolidated in the compound's interior, using the 3 rooms as a fighting position. The PKM on the slope was the biggest problem. It commanded the courtyard and prevented any movement across open ground. Any attempt to push toward the compound's exterior would be cutting through that gun's field of fire. Kowalski tried to put fire on the elevated position and took a round that punched through the fleshy part of his shoulder, spinning him into a wall. He stayed up. That kind of man. Chen dragged him back. "Talk to me," Ethan said into the radio. "Somebody talk to me." No response from Shadow 6. No response from command. Diaz had the secondary comms and was burning through frequencies, trying to raise anyone. "Nothing, LT. We've got heavy interference or they're jamming us. Can you punch through it?" "Working on it." The PKM shifted its fire, and for 15 seconds the east wall became uninhabitable. Everyone pushed to the floor. Rounds came through the upper section of the mud brick and threw chunks of hardened clay across the room. Tron caught one in the helmet and sat down like someone had switched him off. He shook his head and got back up, which was either fine or would become a problem later. "Tron." I'm up. "You see stars?" "I always see stars. I grew up in Vegas." Garza laughed from the floor, which meant Park had done something right with the leg wound. Ethan got to the doorway of the east room and made himself look at the valley. What he saw confirmed what he'd feared. There was no organic exit. The fighters in the valley had used the compound's 3-sided position against them brilliantly. The slope behind the compound was covered by the PKM team. The south gap was now sealed by the 4 fighters who'd entered, plus reinforcements. The north breach point was under direct observation from at least 3 positions outside the wall. He ran the math in his head and didn't like the answer. 8 men, 2 with mobility issues, 1 with a concussion, against what looked like 30 fighters who had arrived knowing exactly where they'd be. This was not a chance contact. This was not an ambush. An ambush was opportunistic. An ambush happened when an enemy patrol stumbled across an opportunity and reacted. This was a preset. Every position was pre-staged. The PKM team had been in position before Ethan's team entered the valley. The fighters who came through the south wall were waiting inside a prepared hide. The fighters in the valley were already bounding in an organized tactical pattern when the shooting started. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had known the route, the timing, the compound objective, and the overwatch position. Ethan pressed his forehead against the mud brick wall and let that thought settle into him like something heavy and cold. Then he picked up his rifle and turned back to his team. The radio came to life at the 40-minute mark. Not Diaz's secondary comms. Ethan's own handset, the primary, which had been dead since before they entered the valley. Static, a carrier tone, and then a voice. Female, quiet. The kind of quiet that came from someone who was aware of how much sound could travel. "Hammer actual, Shadow 6. I have your position. Don't move the east wall." Ethan stared at the handset. "I say again, do not expose the east wall. 2 fighters with PKM ammunition are 20 meters from your east breach point. I've had eyes on them for 4 minutes. Shadow 6, this is Hammer Actual. Authentication." It wasn't hostile skepticism. It was protocol. You didn't redirect your behavior based on a voice you couldn't verify, not in an environment where the enemy ran PSYOP operations on open frequencies. A pause. Then she read a code phrase that matched Ethan's card exactly. "Authenticated," he said. "Shadow 6, what's your status?" "1 up." "1 person. The Overwatch team was supposed to be 2. Your enemy commander is standing 110 meters south-southwest of your position, center of the valley. He's the one in the tan vest with the radio. He's been directing the assault since the start." Ethan moved to a position where he could see through a crack in the south wall. He found the man she was describing in 4 seconds. Mid-40s, heavy-set, moving with the deliberate authority of someone who knew he was in command and felt no particular urgency because he believed the outcome was not in question. "I see him." The PKM team is about to reposition. When they do, they'll have a line on your west room. You have about 90 seconds before they're set. Copy. I can give you a window. When the PKM moves, I'll take the crew. You'll have 30 seconds in the courtyard. Use it to push your people to the northern interior room. The wall there is thicker. And then? A pause that was longer than he expected. Then we figure out the next part. She gave them exactly what she'd promised. The PKM crew started to move, 2 men carrying the gun and a can of ammunition, repositioning along the slope to the new firing point. They made it 4 steps. 2 shots. Each one clean. 1 gunner, 1 assistant gunner, both down before the second shot finished echoing off the valley walls. Move! Ethan was already through the doorway, pulling Garza up and getting his arm over his shoulder, moving fast across the courtyard. 20 feet of open ground that felt like 100. Webb went first, creating the angle, covering Ethan as he dragged Garza through. Park grabbed the other side. They covered the distance in 8 seconds. The courtyard floor behind them erupted as fighters in the valley tried to take advantage. Too slow, too disorganized, not anticipating the move. All 8 of them made the northern room. Ethan leaned against the wall and let himself breathe for 4 seconds. Around him, his team was checking themselves, checking each other. Garza's leg was wrapped, and he was propped against the wall with his rifle across his lap. Kowalski had his offhand pressed against his shoulder and his strong hand on his pistol. Tran was functional, but moving carefully. The rest were intact. Shadow 6. Ethan keyed the radio. We're consolidated. What do you have? 26 fighters remaining in the valley. They're regrouping. Your enemy commander is calling someone on a sat phone. How long until they try again? 5 minutes, maybe less. Ethan looked at the faces of his team. 5 minutes. What's your exfil? He asked into the radio. Another pause. I don't have one. The words landed in the room like a stone into still water. Ethan looked at Webb, who said nothing, but whose expression said enough. A sniper operating alone on a ridgeline, without extraction, in a valley full of fighters who were now very aware that someone on that mountain was killing them. He tried once more to raise command on the main net. Diaz worked the secondary. Nothing. Shadow 6, Ethan said. Keep talking to me. I'm here, she said. And then she said something else, quieter, like it wasn't really meant for the radio. I've been here. The 5 minutes became 7. On the 8th minute, the enemy commander stepped to the center of the valley floor. He had a prisoner with him. Ethan saw it through the crack in the south wall, a figure being pushed forward, stumbling, hands behind his back. Military uniform, American. He couldn't see the rank or name from this distance, but the man was conscious, upright, jaw set against whatever was happening to him. A Marine. From where? From how? Ethan didn't know. A downed crew member, an attached advisor, someone who'd been in the wrong place. The enemy commander held a pistol. He stood in the center of the valley with 30 fighters visible on the surrounding terrain and a pistol pressed against the back of a Marine's head, and he waited. He was waiting for the SEALs to come out. Not because he thought they would. He was waiting because watching them not come out would tell the fighters surrounding the compound something important. These Americans would let one of their own die to protect themselves. It was a message. Not to the SEAL team, to his own men. He's using him to read us, Webb said from beside Ethan. I know. If we go out, I know, Marcus. Webb fell quiet. Ethan watched the enemy commander raise the pistol to the Marine's temple. He made a calculation that he would think about for years afterward, turning it over in his mind in hotel rooms and on long flights, and in the particular silence of 3 a.m. in a house where everyone else was sleeping. The calculation was cold and it was correct, and it didn't feel like either of those things when he was making it. You didn't trade 8 lives for 1. You couldn't. The rifle shot cracked down from the mountain like the sound of a door slamming in an empty building. The enemy commander dropped. The pistol hit the valley floor. The Marine fell forward onto his knees, alive. And then, complete, absolute silence. 30 fighters in the valley, 8 SEALs in a compound, 1 Marine on his knees in the open air, and nobody moved, because nobody had expected that. The commander was dead. In the middle of his own performance, at the moment of his fullest control, he had simply stopped. And somewhere on the mountain above them, in a position nobody outside her own mind could locate, A woman Ethan Walker had never met chambered another round and waited to see who was going to be the first person in that valley brave enough to give her a reason to fire it. The silence in the valley lasted 4 seconds. Then it shattered. The 30 fighters who'd been standing in organized tactical positions around the compound broke, not in retreat, not in panic, but in the particular controlled scatter of men who'd just lost their anchor point and were defaulting to training. They moved for cover. They moved fast. The Marine on his knees in the center of the valley floor stayed exactly where he was, head down, hands still bound behind him, making himself small in the way that people who've been in bad situations learn to do. Ethan keyed his radio before the echo of the rifle shot had finished rolling down the valley walls. Shadow 6, Hammer Actual. The Marine in the open. He's ours. We're going to need a window. I see him. He's not being targeted right now. They're repositioning. Where? East and south. They're trying to figure out my angle. Can they? A pause that was exactly long enough to be honest. They'll narrow it down eventually. Webb was already at Ethan's shoulder, reading the valley through the same crack in the wall. She buys us time if they're hunting her instead of stacking on us. She also dies if they find her. Yeah, Webb said it flatly, without commentary. It was just the arithmetic of the situation. Ethan watched the valley. The fighters were good, better than the average regional militia, better than the irregular cells he'd gone up against in similar terrain. They communicated with hand signals and short radio bursts. They moved in pairs and covered each other's transitions. Whoever had trained them had done it properly, and that meant whoever had planned this operation had resources, connections, and enough lead time to prepare a coordinated ambush against a SEAL team with Overwatch. That last part kept snagging in his mind like a loose thread on a nail. They'd known about the Overwatch. A sniper team on a ridgeline was not standard information. It wasn't in the mission brief that went to the local command structure. It wasn't communicated through normal channels. The only people who knew the exact position of Shadow 6 were the people in that TOC, the Overwatch team itself, and the operations staff who'd processed the mission order. He filed it. He filed it hard, in the mental drawer labeled Deal with Later, because right now the immediate problem was 30 fighters and one stranded Marine and a sniper alone on a mountain who just told him she didn't have extraction. Park, he said without turning around. Sir? Garza's status. Stable. The bleed is controlled. He can walk if he has to, but he shouldn't run. What about extended movement over rough ground? A beat. He'll do it. He won't love it. Nobody's going to love anything tonight. On the mountain, Staff Sergeant Maya Collins had her eye to the scope and her breathing dialed down to a number that most people would have to practice for a decade to reach. And she was running calculations in her head that had nothing to do with ballistics. The shot that dropped the enemy commander had taken 3 seconds of decision time, which was 2 seconds longer than usual. Not because the shot itself was complicated. It was a stationary target at 340 meters in light wind, well inside her confirmed range. But because the moment she pulled that trigger, she stopped being invisible. You didn't fire from a hide and expect the hide to remain viable. The sound, the direction, the slight disturbance of dust or vegetation around the muzzle. Anyone who knew what they were looking for would start working the angles immediately. She'd had maybe 60 seconds before the systematic search began. She'd already used 40 of them repositioning. The scope in her new position showed the valley in sharp relief. She was 30 meters east of her original firing point, behind a natural rock formation that offered good concealment and decent cover and a slightly degraded sightline to the valley floor. She'd lost the center-south area, picked up better angles on the east approaches. Trade-offs. Everything was trade-offs. She pulled back from the scope and looked at the space beside her. Daniel Reed's gear was still there. His pack, his spotting scope still mounted on its tripod, his notebook with the range cards they'd built together the night before. Meticulous, his range cards. He wrote the distances in a tiny, precise hand, wine notations on the left margin, elevation adjustments in red ink, his personal system that she'd teased him about when they were first paired and had come to rely on completely. The shot that hit him hadn't come from the valley. That was what was wrong. That was the thing that had been eating at her since the moment it happened, 22 minutes ago now, before Ethan's team even reached the compound. She and Daniel had been in position on the ridge for 3 hours. Pre-dawn insertion, careful movement, establish their hide before first light the way they were trained. Nobody should have known they were there. Their position wasn't radioed until they checked in with the TOC at H-60, and even then the coordinates transmitted were a general area, not the specific hide. But the shot that hit Daniel had come from the north, from above and behind their position, from somewhere that required prior knowledge of where they'd be. She'd heard it, not the impact first, but the shot, because the shooter was far enough away that sound traveled in the order it should. A single suppressed crack from the high ground to the north, and then Daniel was on the ground with a wound in his left shoulder, and Maya had spent 4 seconds in pure reactive mode, grabbing him, pulling him behind the rocks, pressing her hand against the wound while her brain caught up to what had just happened. Dan. She'd kept her voice low, very low. Dan, look at me. He'd looked at her. His face was white, but his eyes were tracking. Through and through, he'd said, which was Daniel's way of doing his own assessment. She'd checked. I was right. The round had punched in from the back and exited the front of the shoulder, which was luck in the way that these things sometimes broke. No major vessels. Significant muscle damage. A lot of blood, manageable with pressure and the contents of her IFAC. Can you move? Yeah, give me a second. She'd given him 10 seconds. Then she'd gotten him to a secondary hide 15 meters back from their position, lower, with better concealment and no sightline to the north. She'd packed the wound, he'd done his own tourniquet, she'd reinforced it, and she'd left him with his sidearm and her secondary radio, which had intermittent connectivity at best in this terrain. Stay here. Do not move unless they're right on top of you. Maya, I mean it. Stay down and stay quiet. She'd gone back to the original position, picked up her rifle, and that was when she'd gotten her first clear look at the valley floor, just in time to watch the compound explode into a firefight. The thing people didn't understand about sniping, the thing that movies got wrong almost universally, was that the job was 90% patience and 10% everything else. It was watching, it was waiting, it was building a picture from fragments of information and holding that picture in your head while the world kept adding new fragments, some of which changed the whole shape of what you were looking at. Maya had been building her picture for 22 minutes. It was not a comfortable picture. The assault on the SEAL team was too organized. She'd seen bad guy operations ranging from barely controlled chaos to competent militia coordination. This was above that. The fighters moved with purpose and communicated effectively, and most importantly, they had pre-staged their weapons positions before the SEAL team arrived. The PKM nest on the slope, the fighters waiting inside the compound's south approach, the valley element moving in tactical bounds. None of that happened spontaneously. Someone had studied the mission plan, and the attempt on her and Daniel before the operation even started was not a coincidence she was willing to accept. She swept the scope across the valley floor and found the Marine again. He was still kneeling in the open, which told her the fighters were too disorganized after the commander's death to manage him, or they decided he wasn't currently useful, or both. He was alive. His head was up. He was watching the compound wall with the focused attention of someone who was very much trying to understand their situation. Smart kid, whoever he was. She found Ethan Walker's team through the gap in the north wall. She could see movement in the interior rooms, the shapes of men repositioning, checking equipment. 8 men. The wounded were managing. None of them were running, which told her something about the quality of the unit she was working with. A fighter moved to the east approach, high-crawling toward the compound wall. She tracked him, let him get to within 20 meters of the wall, then adjusted for the wind, 8 kilometers per hour, left to right, at this range a quarter-minute correction, and sent the round. He stopped moving. She worked the bolt and reacquired the valley. Another fighter had been watching the first. He made the mistake of holding his position for 2 seconds too long while he processed what he'd just seen. She took that too. Then she relocated again. 30 meters west, behind a different rock formation, lower than she preferred, but out of the angle she'd just compromised. This was how it worked when you were alone. You fired and you moved. You never let them establish your pattern. You made them feel like there were multiple shooters and let the paranoia do part of your work for you. The problem was that relocating took time, and time was the one resource that kept shrinking. She had approximately 40 rounds of Tharpi 338 La Pua remaining. She'd used 6, including the 2 on the PKM crew and the commander and the 2 flankers just now. She had a sidearm with 2 magazines. She had her IFAK, her water, 3 energy bars, and a radio that could reach the SEAL team but hadn't successfully raised the TOC since before Daniel got hit. She tried the TOC frequency again. Static. Carrier tone. Nothing. She tried the emergency frequency. Same. Either they were being jammed, which required sophisticated equipment and implied a level of resourcing that was itself alarming, or something had happened at the TOC that she didn't know about yet. She didn't let herself think about that second option for more than a second, because thinking about it wouldn't help anything, and she had enough immediate problems. She keyed the SEAL frequency. Hammer Actual Shadow 6. How are you on ammunition? Ethan's voice came back steady. Sufficient for now. We've been conservative. Your east approach is clear. I just addressed 2 fighters working toward your wall. A pause. Understood. Good, thank you. Don't thank me yet. They're going to try the south next. The fighters who came through your south gap earlier. 3 of them repositioned to the boulders at your 2 o'clock. They're waiting for a distraction. What kind of distraction? The kind someone creates on purpose. She watched the south cluster through her scope. 3 fighters. Good concealment. Disciplined. They hadn't moved since they'd settled into those boulders 15 minutes ago. Somebody is still directing this operation. Your commander is down, but they're not breaking. Someone is maintaining command. She heard Ethan's voice drop slightly, the register of a man doing math he didn't like. A second in command. Or a handler. Someone outside the valley who's watching this on comms and making decisions. The silence on the other end was brief and full. Then, you're saying this isn't over even if we eliminate every fighter in this valley. I'm saying that possibility is worth considering, yes. Another silence. What's your status, Shadow 6? Your actual status? She considered how to answer that. The honest version was that she was alone on a ridge with a compromised position, a wounded spotter she couldn't reach, limited ammunition, no confirmed exfil, and the growing suspicion that whoever had planned this operation had resources that extended back to their own command structure. The diplomatic version was essentially the same information delivered at a pace that didn't cause panic. I'm functional, she said. 1 up. My spotter is stable but non-mobile, and I can't reach him right now. The shot that came from the north before the firefight started, that was an attempt on your position? Yes. Your spotter was hit before you could warn us? Yes. But the shot came from the north, above and behind your position. She heard it in his voice, the same thread she'd been pulling at for 22 minutes. Yes, she said, from ground that required prior knowledge of where we were. The radio was quiet long enough that she checked to make sure the connection was still live. Keep talking to me, Shadow 6. I'm here. South cluster is still static. They're waiting. What are they waiting for? Good question. She watched the boulders. 3 fighters, holding position, not advancing, not communicating visibly with the valley element. Just waiting. Patient in a way that felt less like discipline and more like instruction. The answer arrived in her scope before it arrived in her mind, because she saw it before she understood what she was seeing. A 4th fighter coming from the east, moving low and fast toward the south boulder cluster. He was carrying something. It took her 2 seconds to identify it. A radio. A large handset, field expedient, the kind of gear that extended communications range in terrain that ate normal frequencies. It wasn't a fighter. He was a relay. Someone outside this valley was talking to this operation in real time, routing communications through that handset, and they'd just sent a runner to update the south cluster with new instructions. Hammer Actual. She kept her voice level. Someone is running this operation remotely. They just pushed a communications relay to your south cluster. Can you take the relay? She could. The runner had settled into the boulder cluster and was handing the handset to the apparent leader of the group, who pressed it to his ear and listened. She had a clear angle on the runner. The man with the relay equipment was the priority, not the fighters. Taking the relay now. She fired. The runner went down. The handset hit the dirt. The leader of the south cluster reached for it, and she fired again. Not at him, but at the handset itself. It was a difficult shot, and she wasn't entirely confident, but she saw the device skitter sideways in a way that suggested impact. Then she moved. Fast. Low. Abandoning her current position before anyone in the south cluster could establish her angle, covering 15 meters of broken ridge on hands and knees, rifle cradled across her arms, until she found a gap between two large rocks and pressed herself into it. Her heart was running faster than she wanted. She gave it 10 seconds. Then she raised the scope and looked at the south cluster. The leader was on his radio, his personal unit, short range, and he was looking up at the mountain. Specifically, he was looking at the area she'd just vacated, but the large relay handset was on the ground, and it wasn't moving, and nobody was picking it up. "Relay is down," she said into the radio. "Copy that," Ethan's voice. Then after a beat, "That was a long shot. Everything up here is a long shot." What? The valley went through a 10-minute reorganization that Maya watched with the careful attention of a person who knows that silence from an enemy is often worse than noise. The fighters consolidated. They moved away from the positions she'd compromised and established new ones, farther out, better spread, harder to service with single shots. They were adapting to her. That was what competent fighters did. They took information from what was hurting them and changed their behavior. She filed every new position. Inside the compound, Ethan's team was using the time. She could tell from the radio traffic, short, clipped exchanges that told her they were moving wounded, redistributing ammunition, preparing for a push that hadn't been decided yet. Webb's voice came on once to ask her about the north route out of the compound. She gave him honest numbers. One visible position, possibly flanked. She couldn't guarantee the dead ground without repositioning. How long to reposition? 4 minutes. "Can we have it in 3? She was already moving. She got it done in 3.5 and called it a moral victory. The north route had 2 fighters behind a natural berm, 40 meters from the compound wall. They were set and disciplined, and they'd been there long enough to get comfortable. She worked the wind, which had shifted since her last reading, now coming more from the northwest, requiring a correction she had to build from scratch because her range card was with Daniel's gear. She did it from memory. From the notations Daniel had written in red ink that she'd read over his shoulder enough times that she could see the numbers when she closed her eyes. First shot. Slightly low. She saw the impact. Adjusted. Second shot hit. Third shot for the second fighter. "North route has a problem," she said into the radio. "We saw. Is it solved?" 2 targets down. Watch for secondary. I can't guarantee that's all of them." Understood. She found a new position and watched the valley settle into its reorganized pattern. The fighters were tighter now, more cautious, taking angles that minimized their exposure to the mountain. They weren't breaking. They weren't going to break. But they were afraid of her. She could tell. It was in the way they moved, hunched, quick across open ground, never staying static, constantly checking the mountain. She was one person with a rifle, and she was in their heads, and that was worth more than the round she had left. The problem was that fear had a way of making people do desperate things. She swept back to the south and found something new. 2 fighters were pushing the Marine, the kneeling Marine who'd been abandoned in the open since the commander died. They were moving him, dragging him upright, binding his hands higher, pulling him toward the south wall of the compound. She tracked them and understood immediately what they were doing. They were going to use him again. Not as a performance this time, as a shield. They were going to put him at the compound's south entrance and push through it, using his body to prevent her from engaging the fighters around him. It was a smart adjustment. She keyed the radio. "Hammer actual. They're moving your Marine, south entrance, approximately 90 seconds. They're going to use him as cover for a breach." "How many fighters in the push?" she counted. 8 in the first wave, more behind. "Can you engage without hitting the Marine?" She looked at the angle. The fighters were flanking the Marine, one on each side, right against him, their bodies deliberately overlapping his as they moved. It was exactly the coverage designed to prevent her from taking a shot. Not designed by someone who'd just improvised it under fire. Designed by someone who'd thought about how a sniper would respond. "The angle is difficult," she said. "If they get him to the south entrance, I lose the shot entirely. The compound wall blocks my view. Can you break up the push before they get there?" She had maybe 40 seconds before they reached the wall. She picked the fighter at the back of the formation, the one coordinating the group, hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him, directing the pace. Farther from the Marine. Harder shot in this position, but clean. She sent it. The coordinator went down. The formation stuttered. The 2 men holding the Marine tightened their grip and pushed faster, breaking into something close to a run, covering the remaining distance to the south wall in seconds. They made it. The Marine disappeared behind the compound wall. Maya lowered the rifle and let out a long breath. Shadow 6, They made the wall. Marine is inside the compound exterior now. I don't have the angle. The radio was quiet. Copy, Ethan said. His voice hadn't changed register, which was the voice of a man absorbing bad news without adding to it. Then Webb's voice, lower, not meant for the radio but picked up anyway. They just changed this into a hostage dynamic. She heard Ethan respond to him in a tone she couldn't quite make out. Then silence. She looked at her ammunition, 31 rounds. She looked at her position, which she'd been in for 4 minutes and would need to vacate soon. She looked at the valley, which had 30-odd fighters in it who were scared of her but hadn't stopped and weren't going to. And she looked at the north slope of the mountain, in the direction of the secondary hide where she'd left Daniel Reed with a packed shoulder wound and a sidearm, and no way of knowing whether he was still in the same place or whether someone had found him while she was working the valley. She hadn't been able to raise him on the secondary radio for 40 minutes. She tried again. The radio hissed. And then, faint, broken by terrain and distance and whatever damage the signal was fighting through, she heard his voice. Maya. One word. Her name. She couldn't hear anything else. The signal dropped immediately. But it was enough to tell her he was conscious, and he'd heard her trying to reach him. She pressed her back against the rock and stared at the sky above the valley. Dark still, the eastern horizon only beginning to show the first gray suggestion of coming light. And she ran through everything she knew. The mission had been compromised before it began. The Overwatch position had been betrayed. The SEAL team had been walked into a preset ambush. Daniel had been shot by a gunman who knew exactly where to aim. The relay communications indicated someone was running this from outside the valley in real time, and every attempt to reach the TOC, from her radio and from the SEAL teams, had returned nothing. She thought about the TOC. She thought about the briefing she hadn't attended but had been given a summary of. She thought about the operations officer who'd signed off on her team's insertion coordinates, because that signature had been in the corner of the grid sheet she'd received, neat and small. Major Adrian Vale. She'd never worked with him directly. She knew the name from the command structure, from the administrative signatures at the bottom of mission orders. She had no reason to think about him right now, and every piece of evidence she'd assembled over the last hour was pointing her in a direction she couldn't yet see clearly but could feel. The radio crackled, Ethan's voice, even and careful. Shadow 6, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Go ahead. The shot that hit your spotter, before the firefight, you said it came from the north. That's correct? From above your position? Yes. Our mission file had the Overwatch grid coordinates included as a planning annex. Standard documentation. She knew where he was going. I know, she said. That document was processed through operations staff at the TOC before distribution. I know. A pause. Then, who signed your insertion coordinates? She had already remembered, but hearing herself say the name out loud felt like the moment before you pull a splinter, the last second before the sting. Major Vale, she said. Major Adrian Vale. The radio didn't respond for a long moment. When Ethan's voice came back, it was flat in a way that was distinct from his normal flat. Not controlled, but something harder beneath the control. He was in the TOC when we departed, he said. He's the one who gave me the final briefing. Maya closed her eyes. When she opened them, the eastern horizon had gone from gray to the faintest possible shade of pale. The kind of light that wasn't really light yet, but was the promise of it. The world beginning the slow process of becoming visible. In an hour, it would be full daylight. In full daylight, she had nowhere left to hide. The light was coming whether she was ready for it or not. Maya pressed herself against the rock and did what she'd been trained to do when the situation outpaced the plan. She stopped moving, stopped transmitting, and spent 60 seconds doing nothing but looking and listening. The valley below was reorganizing itself in the gray pre-dawn in ways that told her things. The fighters had pulled back from the compound's immediate perimeter, not retreating, consolidating, giving themselves distance from the sniper angles they'd already paid for. They were spacing wider now, using the valley's natural terrain features as micro-cover, making themselves harder to service with single shots across a broad front. Smart. Which meant whoever was advising them, remotely, through whatever communications channel survived the relay she'd broken, was still in the conversation. She thought about Major Adrian Vale sitting in the TOC 3 hours ago, watching the mission clock, knowing exactly what was happening in this valley. That thought didn't help anything, so she put it back in the drawer and focused on the immediate geometry. Daylight was the problem. Her current hide was viable in darkness because darkness was the great equalizer. It compressed the sniper's advantage and the hunter's disadvantage into the same narrow bandwidth. When the sun came up over the eastern ridge in approximately 40 minutes, the calculus changed completely. She'd be working against a lit background with fighters who had been studying her shooting positions for an hour and a half. She needed to move up the mountain. Higher ground, more rock cover, worse angles to the valley floor, but better survivability. She also needed to tell Ethan Walker what that meant for his team. She keyed the radio. Hammer actual. Go. When the light comes, I'm going to lose effective engagement range on the valley floor. I'll still have angles on the south approach and the east route, but the center, where your extraction zone is, I won't be able to cover that. A pause. How long until light? 40 minutes, maybe 35. The helicopter window opens in 50. She did the math and didn't say anything about what the math produced. Ethan said it for her. There's a 15-minute gap where we're in the open and you can't cover us. That's the shape of it, yes. Can you speed up the exfil? I can't speed up the sun. Another pause. She heard voices in the background on his end. Webb, she thought, and then Diaz's higher register. And then Ethan came back. We're going to try to raise the helicopter on emergency frequency. If we can get them to move the window forward, hammer actual, the jamming. She'd been thinking about this. If we're being jammed, and we should assume we are, the helicopter crew won't have received any updated timing requests. They're flying the original plan. Silence. So they arrive at the original window, Ethan said, in 50 minutes, into a hot valley, and we're in the open for 15 of those minutes with reduced overwatch. Yes, she heard him breathe. Just breathe, one controlled exhale. Okay, he said. Then we worked the problem. Putz. The problem had several moving parts and none of them were cooperating. Inside the compound, Ethan laid it out for his team in 30 seconds flat. No decoration, no softening. 50-minute exfil window, 15-minute gap in overwatch coverage. 2 wounded with mobility limitations. 1 Marine hostage in the compound exterior held by fighters who'd already demonstrated they were willing to use him. Unknown number of enemy fighters reorganizing for a push that was coming. Webb listened with his arms crossed. When Ethan finished, Webb said, "The Marine." "Yeah." "We don't leave him." "No." "Which means we go south before we go to the extraction zone." "Yes." "Through the fighters who just took him." Ethan looked at him steadily. "That's the shape of it." Webb turned to the rest of the team. Garza was on the floor with his back against the wall, leg wrapped, rifle across his knees. Kowalski had his shoulder wound packed and was working his trigger hand, opening and closing his fingers, checking function. Tran was on the east wall watching through a crack. Reese, Chen, Diaz, and Park were in various stages of equipment prep. "Anybody got a problem with the shape of it?" Webb asked the room. Nobody did. That was the kind of team it was. Ethan went back to the radio. "Shadow 6, the Marine in the compound exterior, before you have to move position. What can you see?" 2 fighters with him, visible. South exterior, pressed against the compound wall. They're using the wall as cover from the valley. They're worried about their own people engaging them accidentally. "Can you work around the wall to the east?" "I can get an angle on the east edge of the south wall. It gives me a partial view of the exterior, maybe 40% coverage. If we push south through the interior rooms and breach the south wall, the same gap those fighters came through, can you cover the exterior?" Her response came back measured. "I can cover part of it. The 2 fighters holding the Marine are against the wall directly. If they move him away from the wall when they hear you breaching, if they try to use him to face you, I might get the angle." "Might?" "Might," she confirmed. No apology in it, just honesty. Ethan turned to Reese, who was the best breacher they had. "You heard that?" "Heard it." "We go on Shadow 6's call. The moment she fires, we're through the wall." Reese nodded once. On the mountain, Maya was already moving for the new position. She did it in stages, short bounds, rock to rock, using the remaining darkness the way you use the last of anything valuable, carefully, without waste. The eastern sky was going from pale gray to something with actual color in it now, the first pink edge of the coming sun appearing above the ridgeline, with the unhurried certainty of something that didn't care about anyone's tactical situation. She got to the new position, a shelf of rock 15 meters higher than her last, with a natural parapet of boulders that had fallen from somewhere above and lodged against each other in a way that formed almost a proper firing position, and got her scope up. The south exterior of the compound came into partial view exactly as she'd calculated. 40%. Maybe 45. She found the Marine immediately. He was sitting against the compound wall with his knees up and his hands still bound, and one of the two fighters was directly beside him while the other was 2 meters away, watching the valley over the compound wall's broken top edge. The Marine's head was up. He was watching the fighter beside him the way you watched a dog you didn't know. Not aggressive, but tracking every movement. Smart kid. She keyed the radio, kept her voice below conversational. I have the angle. Partial, but workable. The fighter directly beside the Marine is 6 inches from him. I cannot take that shot without higher certainty than I have. Copy. What about the second fighter? He's clear. I can take him any time. Don't. Not yet. If the first fighter reacts to the second going down, he may put himself between you and the Marine. She'd thought the same thing. Agreed. We need them separated. Give me 2 minutes. She didn't ask what he was planning. She watched the exterior and waited. What Ethan was planning was a distraction, which was a charitable word for it. He sent Diaz and Park to the east wall of the compound with instructions to make noise, controlled, deliberate, the kind of noise that suggested movement without committing to a specific direction. Scraping boots on stone. A deliberate collision with a loose piece of corrugated metal that had fallen from the ceiling. One short, sharp radio transmission on an open frequency that any fighter with a scanner would hear. The point was to pull the attention of the south exterior fighters toward the east wall, creating the instinctive rotation that anyone watching a perimeter makes when they hear something that might be a threat. The fighter watching over the compound wall to the south turned east. The fighter beside the Marine turned east. In doing so, he shifted 18 inches away from the Marine's shoulder. That was all Maya needed. She put the round through the second fighter, the one watching the valley, first, because he was the one with his weapon raised. He dropped without a sound at this distance, which meant she heard nothing, only saw him drop. The fighter beside the Marine heard the impact before he understood it, which cost him 1 second of processing time, and in that second he took a step toward his fallen partner. Away from the Marine. Maya fired. The shot was not perfect. She knew it wasn't perfect from the moment she broke the trigger. A slight push, a fraction of a millimeter of inconsistency in her grip, the kind of thing you couldn't feel until the round was already gone and you read the result. The fighter went down, but not cleanly, not instantly, and she watched him hit the ground and struggle, and she worked the bolt and sent the second round before he could recover. He stopped moving. She keyed the radio. Clear, 2 down. Your Marine is alone against the south wall. Ethan's voice, breaching. She heard it even from the mountain, the crack and slam of a wall section coming apart under pressure, and then shouting in English and the sharp, flat bark of suppressed gunfire from inside the compound. And then, nothing. 20 seconds. We have him, Ethan said. He's up. He's moving. She let herself exhale. Then she got back on the scope because the valley wasn't done with any of them. The breach had not gone unnoticed. The fighters in the valley had heard it and reacted, not with the disciplined tactical movement she'd seen earlier, but with something edgier, faster, less organized. She counted 11 fighters beginning to move toward the compound from the south and east. Behind them, another cluster of 7 or 8 was holding, watching, waiting, and she couldn't tell if that was a reserve element or men who'd decided that closing on a compound with an active sniper was a decision they wanted more information about before they made. She worked the 11 movers. First shot, the lead element, 40 meters from the compound wall. He dropped, and the man behind him hesitated, which was the wrong thing to do in the open, and she took the hesitation too. She moved. New position, 10 meters west. Got the scope back up. 9 movers remaining. They'd spread wider after the first 2 hits, using the terrain, not giving her the easy linear target anymore. She found one who'd overextended, gotten too far ahead of his partner, exposed his flank, and took him. 8. She moved again. Below, she could hear through the radio the sounds of Ethan's team moving through the compound interior. Webb's voice, curt, directional. Stack on the north wall. Garza, you're in the middle. Park stays on you. Reese, you've got point. The Marine, she still didn't have his name, was apparently ambulatory, which was the best possible news. She found a position behind a low rock shelf that gave her a sight line to the east approach, and swept it. 4 fighters had worked the dead ground along the east edge of the valley and were now 20 meters from the compound wall, moving in a crouch, trying to use the compound itself as cover from her angle. They were right. From her current position, the compound wall was blocking most of her view of their approach. She moved again, up and east, 20 meters, higher than she wanted to be, exposure she didn't like. But the angle opened. She found the 4-man element and took the trailing fighter to force the group to slow down, then moved immediately before anyone in the valley could establish her new position. The rock shelf she landed behind was barely large enough to cover her body, and she pressed herself against it with the rifle up and the scope moving. The eastern sky was fully bright now, not direct sunlight yet. The sun was still behind the eastern ridge, but full ambient light, the kind that made everything visible and removed the last of the darkness's cover. She could see the valley clearly. She could also be seen. She needed to make every remaining shot count. She had 23 rounds. Ethan's team reached the north wall and stacked. The extraction zone was 200 meters north across open ground, the flattest, most exposed 200 meters in the valley. Ahead of them, the terrain offered almost nothing, a shallow drainage ditch that ran roughly north-south about 40 meters out, and beyond that, nothing until the boulders at the valley's northern edge where the helicopter would come in. 2 wounded. 1 rescued Marine with his hands just cut free, working his fingers to get circulation back. 8 SEALs and 1 rifleman who had the wide-eyed controlled focus of someone who'd been in the worst situation of his life for the last 2 hours and was running on the chemistry of still being alive. Webb looked at the 200 meters and then at Ethan. Shadow 6 covers the south and east, Ethan said. We move north fast. Garza and the Marine are center. Everyone else brackets them. If she takes fire while we're moving, then she takes fire. He hated the words. He said them anyway. We can't slow down for it. Webb held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the team. On the LT's call, nobody stops. Nobody goes back. We get to those boulders, and we hold there for the bird. He keyed the radio. Shadow 6, hammer actual. We're about to break north. 11 minutes to the bird window. I have the south and east. 4 fighters still active in the south cluster, 7 or 8 in reserve east of center. I'll work them as long as I can. Copy that. Moving in 30. He looked at his team one more time. Garza had his rifle in one hand and his other hand on Park's shoulder. Kowalski's face was pale but set. The Marine. His name was Corporal Denny Walsh, he'd told Ethan in about 8 seconds of compressed information, while his hands were being freed, was standing straight and had taken Diaz's secondary sidearm without being asked and checked the chamber before anyone told him to. 30 seconds, Ethan said. He looked at the open ground. He looked at the drainage, about Maya Collins alone on that mountain with 20-odd rounds and no extraction plan, covering their movement with her body as the target. Then he pushed that thought down hard, where it would wait for him until after, and he raised his hand. On the mountain, Maya watched them break from the compound's north wall and felt something shift in her chest. Not emotion exactly, more like a gear engaging, a click of focus that narrowed everything down to the work. She swept south. The 4 fighters in the south cluster had seen the movement. They were reacting, coming up from their positions, beginning to advance. She took the lead fighter at 60 meters and worked the bolt before the sound of the shot reached the valley floor. Second fighter was adjusting his direction, turning toward the new threat from the mountain, and that adjustment cost him the half-second that made the difference. 2 down. She moved 6 meters east, got back on the scope. The remaining 2 south fighters had dropped flat. Smart. They weren't giving her a target. She left them and swept to the east cluster. The reserve element, 7 fighters, possibly 8, had begun to move. They'd used the time while she was working the south cluster to close distance, and now they were inside 70 meters of the north wall, moving in the same disciplined bounding pattern she'd seen at the start of the night. She put rounds into the formation, not hunting individual targets, but disrupting the movement, forcing pauses, making them react to the mountain instead of advancing on the open ground where Ethan's team was crossing. She hit 2. The formation split. Half went to ground, half broke east. She took one of the eastern movers. Moved. New position. The rock shelf she'd planned to use was too exposed in the growing light. She could feel it as she arrived. The open sky above her. No overhead cover. A position that worked in darkness and died in daylight. She kept moving, found a wedge between 2 large boulders, pressed in. Scope up. Ethan's team was halfway across the open ground. They were running, not sprinting, but a fast tactical movement. Garza and Walsh in the center. Everyone else moving in a pattern that kept bodies between the wounded and the east threat. They hit the drainage ditch and went through it without stopping, which was the right call. The ditch was a pause point, and a pause point in the open was a coffin. The 2 South fighters who'd gone flat were up. She saw them rise in her peripheral vision and swung the scope. One was already running toward the compound, no longer interested in the fight. The other had his weapon up and was tracking Ethan's group across the open ground. She took that one, worked the bolt, checked the count in her head. 14 rounds remaining. The eastern cluster had reorganized. The men who'd gone to ground were up again, and the ones who'd broken east were looping back. 7 fighters, and they were inside 50 meters of the extraction zone boulders now, which meant if Ethan's team reached the boulders before they did, it was a fight at close range in confined terrain. She needed to slow them. She fired into the formation at the rate that the bolt would allow. Not fast, never fast. Every shot placed, every shot aimed. And she put 3 rounds into the cluster in 8 seconds, hitting 2, and the formation broke apart again. Men scattered to individual cover. The advance stopped. Shadow 6. Ethan's voice breathing hard. We're at the northern boulders. Copy. 7 fighters east, inside 50 meters of your position. They're going to push again in approximately 60 seconds when they regroup. Can you hold them? 12 rounds, 7 fighters. A position that was getting less viable by the minute as the light grew. Yes, she said. She was not certain that was true. What she was certain of was that she was going to do it regardless. The next 8 minutes were the longest of Maya's life, and she'd had some competition for that title. She worked the eastern cluster with surgical care because surgical care was all she had left. No margin for error, no rounds to spare on half-confident shots. She picked targets that were advancing, let the stationary ones stay stationary, and kept moving after every engagement. Her legs were burning from the terrain. Her right shoulder had developed a deep ache from the rifle's recoil across 3+ hours of shooting. Her water was gone. She'd eaten nothing since the pre-mission meal 8 hours ago. None of that mattered enough to occupy her attention. She heard the helicopter before she saw it, the heavy thumping of rotors coming in fast from the west, flying low along the valley wall to reduce radar signature. It appeared over the western ridge with its landing lights off and banked hard toward the extraction zone. 6 rounds left. The eastern fighters heard the helicopter and made their decision. 5 of them rushed the boulder line simultaneously. Not the controlled tactical bound she'd been working against all night, but a hard, aggressive sprint, weapons up, trying to reach the extraction zone before the helicopter landed and took the SEALs out of their reach. They were 40 meters out when they started. She fired. First, 40 meters, running target, left to right angle. She let him the right amount and hit clean, worked the bolt. Second, 35 meters, same general direction, already adjusting course when she found him. She'd have preferred a stationary shot. She didn't have one. She fired and hit and worked the bolt. Third, 25 meters now, he'd covered ground while she was working the others. She rushed the shot by half a second and knew it as she fired. Hit, but not clean. He went down and got back up and kept running. She worked the bolt. The helicopter was on the ground. She could hear it, the rotor wash changing pitch as the pilot held a low hover, not touching down fully, ready to lift the moment the last person was aboard. The third fighter was still moving, 20 meters from the boulder line. She put the 4th round into him, and he didn't get back up. The remaining 2 fighters had gone to ground when their partners dropped. They were there, somewhere in the terrain between the East Valley wall and the boulder line, and she couldn't find them, and she had 2 rounds left. She heard Webb's voice on the radio. All personnel aboard, last call, Shadow 6, you copy? She keyed the radio. 2 fighters unaccounted for east of your position, 10 to 20 meters. Do not lift until you confirm. Shadow 6, we need to go. Do not lift. A 3-second silence that felt like a minute. Then Ethan's voice, not on the radio. In the valley. She looked down and saw him, not aboard the helicopter, standing at the edge of the boulder line, looking east into the terrain. He had his rifle up, and he was sweeping the ground in front of him with the focused attention of someone who was not leaving until he'd answered the question. She found one of the fighters. He'd crawled to a position behind a flat rock visible in the full morning light, and she took him. 1 round left. Webb appeared beside Ethan. He saw the second fighter, closer than the first, inside 15 meters, rising with his weapon coming up, and put a 3-round burst into him from his HK. Both fighters were down. Ethan turned and looked at the mountain. She didn't know if he could see her from that distance. She was in the rock wedge, in shadow, in a position that wasn't designed to be visible. But he looked directly at her hide, with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was. She held the radio without keying it. He keyed his. Shadow 6, get on this helicopter. She looked at the mountain around her. She thought about Daniel in his secondary hide somewhere above her on the north slope, 40 minutes from her current position on foot, with a packed shoulder wound and a sidearm and 2 hours of morning light coming. I can't, she said. Why not? My spotter is still up here. He's wounded. I left him in a hide position, and I haven't been able to get to him. The radio was quiet. She watched the helicopter's rotor wash flatten the scrub grass around the boulder line. What's his condition? Shoulder wound through and through, stable when I left him, but that was 3 hours ago. Location? North slope, upper third, approximately 400 meters from my current position. She heard Ethan say something to Webb that the radio didn't carry. Then, how long to reach him? 40 minutes on foot, rough terrain. Another silence. The helicopter pilot's voice cut through on a shared frequency. Clipped, professional, not happy. Hammer actual, we have a hard window. I cannot hold this position. Copy, Ethan said. And then to his team, words she heard clearly. Everybody stay on the bird. She watched him turn away from the helicopter and start moving. Not toward the mountain, back toward the valley. He was setting up a perimeter position at the boulder line. Webb was arguing with him in low, urgent tones that the radio wasn't picking up cleanly, and she caught fragments. Can't stay here, and what? Window is closing. And Ethan's response, which was short and final. Shadow 6, Ethan said into the radio. Guide me to your spotter. She stared at the radio in her hand. He was staying. A Navy SEAL lieutenant commander with 8 men aboard a helicopter in a hot valley was staying behind in the valley with a rifle and a radio because she had a wounded spotter on the mountain and she'd told him she couldn't reach Daniel in time alone. She had 1 round left and the sun was fully up, and somewhere above her Daniel Reed was in a hide with a packed shoulder wound, and the man in the valley below, who had every reason and every order to be on that helicopter, was looking at the mountain and waiting for her to talk. Shadow 6. His voice again, patient, not insistent, just there. Guide me. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. When she opened them, the morning light was coming across the ridge with the flat, clear quality of high altitude at dawn. The kind of light that showed everything exactly as it was, without the softening that came later in the day. She pressed the radio to her mouth. Head north from the boulder line, she said. There's a game trail at the base of the slope. Follow it east until you see a rockfall. Big boulders, recent. The rock face above them is still pale where it broke. Go up from there. I'll meet you at the base of the rockfall. Moving. She pulled herself out of the rock wedge and started down the mountain. 1 round left in the rifle, a sidearm with 11. Legs that were operating on borrowed credit, and a shoulder that would need a conversation with a doctor she didn't particularly want to have. She moved anyway. Below her in the valley, the helicopter lifted without them. She watched it rise above the boulder line and bank west and get small against the morning sky. And she kept moving, picking her way down the rock-strewn slope toward the game trail, toward the pale rockfall, toward the secondary hide where Daniel Reed had been alone and silent for 3 hours. And she didn't think about the empty valley beneath her, or the fighters who might still be in it, or the man named Vale sitting in a TOC somewhere with a radio and a mission that was supposed to be complete by now. She thought about the step in front of her. Then the one after that. That was all there was. She found the game trail where she said it would be. It was narrow and loose-surfaced, the kind of path that animals made over decades of following the path of least resistance up a mountain. and it wound northeast along the base of the slope in a way that someone unfamiliar with the terrain would have missed entirely. Maya moved along it at a pace that was faster than smart and slower than she wanted, picking her footing on the loose shale sections and trusting her boots on the solid rock. Behind her, the valley was quiet. Not peaceful, quiet in the way that places get quiet after violence, a held breath quality, like the terrain itself was waiting to see if it was over. She didn't think it was over. She keyed the radio without slowing. "Hammer Actual, I'm on the trail heading northeast. Where are you?" "Base of the slope. I found what I think is the trail. There's a rock fall ahead of me, pale rock face above it." "That's it. Go up from the base of the fall. It's loose in the middle. Stay left." "Copy." She could hear his breathing on the radio. Elevated but controlled, a man moving uphill in full kit. She estimated his pace and her own and put their meeting point somewhere above the midpoint of the rockfall in approximately 6 minutes. She used those 6 minutes to think about Daniel. The shoulder wound had been through and through, no major vascular involvement that she could see in the dark with a headlamp and hands that were trying to be steady. She'd packed it clean and wrapped it tight. He'd been conscious and talking when she left, but 3 hours was a long time for a packed wound at altitude, and she hadn't been able to reach him on the secondary radio for most of it, and the silence had a weight to it that she'd been carrying alongside everything else. She reached the base of the rockfall and went up the left side, using her hands on the larger boulders, keeping her rifle slung across her back. The morning light was full and direct now, hitting the pale rock face and bouncing back with a brightness that made her squint. She was exposed. She moved through it quickly. Ethan Walker appeared at the top of the rockfall 40 seconds after she did. He was bigger than she'd expected from the radio voice, broad through the shoulders, moving with the contained deliberateness of someone who'd been doing this long enough that efficiency had replaced effort. His face was dirty and drawn, and he had a cut above his left eye that had dried into a dark line. He took one look at her and didn't say anything for a moment, which she appreciated. Then, "How far?" "100 meters, maybe 120. There's a secondary rock formation above the tree line. The hide is in the northwest corner of it. Lead." She led. Oh! Daniel Reed was where she'd left him. He was conscious, which was the first thing she checked, and his color was bad, which was the second. And when she crouched beside him and put her hand on his forehead, the skin was warm in a way that meant his body was working harder than it should have been. "Hey," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were clear, which was something. "You took your time." "I was busy. I heard the shooting." He shifted slightly against the rock and winced. Sounded like a lot. It was a lot. Ethan was already crouching on the other side of Daniel, cutting away the outer layer of the shoulder wrap to look at the wound. He didn't ask permission. He did it with the focused competence of someone with combat medicine training and enough experience to know that courtesy took second place to information. "Through and through," Maya said. "Left shoulder, posterior entry. I packed it about 3 hours ago." "I can see that." He examined the wound without moving it more than necessary. "Pack's holding. There's some seepage, but it's not arterial." He looked at Daniel. "Pain level?" "Somewhere between I'd like some ibuprofen and please don't touch it." "Can you walk?" "I've been walking fine in my head for 3 hours. Let's find out if my legs agree." Ethan almost smiled. Not quite. "We need to get off this mountain and raise a second extraction. My team should be at the forward base by now. Once they report our position—" "If they can report," Maya said. He looked at her. "The jamming," she said. "If it's still active, it's not going to be active once they're off the mountain and away from the valley." He said it with confidence that had enough uncertainty underneath it that she could hear the seam. The jamming was tactical for the operation. Once we're out of their net, it stops being useful. And if someone at the TOC decides it stays useful? The name sat between them like something physical. Neither of them said it. Ethan pulled out his radio and tried the main command frequency. Static. He tried twice more. The third time, faint but unmistakable, he got a carrier tone. Not a voice, but a signal, the kind of signal that meant someone was on the other end. He transmitted his authentication code and their position. He waited. 20 seconds of static. Then a voice. Scratchy, fragmented, but a voice. "Authenticate. Confirm. This is Lieutenant Commander Walker. Authentication Bravo 79er Delta. We are on the mountain north of Karos Ridge. We have 2 wounded personnel requiring extraction. One is a Navy SEAL, one is Army sniper. Request immediate extraction to the following coordinates. He read the grid. The radio hissed. Then, copy your position. Stand by. Ethan looked at Maya. They've got us. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that they've got us could mean more than one thing, depending on who they were. The extraction helicopter arrived 40 minutes later. A different bird, not the one that had taken his team, but a medevac variant with a flight medic who looked at Daniel's shoulder and did the kind of rapid assessment that Maya had seen done correctly maybe 3 times in her career and watched Ethan do correctly again on the mountain. The medic repacked the wound, got a line in Daniel's arm, and said very little, which was the hallmark of someone who knew their job. The flight back to the forward operating base took 22 minutes. Maya spent those 22 minutes watching the valley shrink below them through the open cargo door, the pale rock of Karos Ridge going small and abstract, and she thought about 30 fighters who'd known exactly where to be, and a communications relay runner who'd brought remote instructions to the South Cluster, and a name at the bottom of a mission grid sheet. Ethan was watching her. She looked at him. He looked back. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He understood what she was asking. "Report what I know." "To who?" "That's a good question." The helicopter banked and the valley disappeared. The forward operating base at Dawari was a collection of prefabricated structures, blast walls, and fortified positions arranged around a central landing pad with the improvised permanence of places that were supposed to be temporary and had stopped trying to pretend. It was 0847 when they touched down. Ethan's team was waiting at the pad. Webb was the first one to the helicopter, and he looked at Ethan with an expression that contained a full conversation compressed into about 3 seconds. Relief, irritation, questions he'd already answered himself, and the particular look of a man who'd spent 40 minutes preparing to be very angry, and now that the anger wasn't needed, didn't know quite what to do with the energy. "You could have been on the bird," Webb said. "She had a man on the mountain." Webb looked at Maya as she stepped off the helicopter. His assessment was quick and not unkind. Shadow 6. Senior Chief. "Your people are good," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a reclassification, the way a person adjusted a category once the data changed. Maya received it with a nod and nothing else. Daniel came off the helicopter on his own feet, which the flight medic had recommended against and Daniel had declined to care about. He was pale and moving carefully, but he was moving. Webb grabbed his good arm to steady him, and Daniel said, "I'm fine," in the tone of someone who was mostly fine and determined to close the gap through sheer insistence. Garza, from somewhere behind Webb, called out, "How many?" Maya looked at him. "Confirmed," Garza said, "from the mountain." "How many?" She'd been keeping count. It was automatic, the way breathing was automatic. 17 confirmed, 3 probable. The pad was quiet for a moment. Kowalski, arm in a field sling, let out a slow breath. 20 fighters, he said. Solo. 17 confirmed, Maya said. And I had a spotter for part of it. For which part? None of the shooting part. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Webb looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked at the main operations building, and the two of them had a conversation with their eyes that lasted about 2 seconds and reached a conclusion. "Get Collins and Reed to medical," Ethan said. "I need 30 minutes." Major Adrian Vale was in the operations center when Ethan walked in. The operations center was a long room with map tables and communication stations and the kind of flat-screen displays that had become standard in forward command environments: satellite feeds, Blue Force tracking overlays, mission status boards. It was staffed by 5 people at that hour of the morning, most of whom looked up when Ethan came through the door. Vale didn't look up immediately. He was standing at the communications board, apparently reading a signals log, and when he did look up, his expression cycled through something. Just a fraction of a second, a flash of something that wasn't surprise and wasn't relief, before it settled into the careful concern of a senior officer greeting a subordinate who'd just come back from a bad mission. "Walker." He came around the table. "Hell of a night. I heard the extract was complicated." "It was." "Your team is okay?" "The report's coming in. 2 wounded, both stable." Ethan didn't move from his position just inside the door. He didn't close the distance. The sniper team that was assigned as Overwatch. They're in medical now. I heard Collins and Reed were declared. We thought they were KIA. They weren't. Clearly. Vale's expression did the thing that experienced officers' expressions did when they were being managed. Open, engaged, showing nothing. That's good news. The mission itself was a compromise, sir. A beat. Meaning? Meaning the enemy had our route, our timing, our compound objective, and the Overwatch position before we inserted. The attack was preset. The enemy commander was directing a coordinated ambush, not responding to a contact. Vale was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. The amount of time it took a senior officer to process a serious allegation and begin formulating a measured response. That's a significant claim. It's not a claim. It's an observation from the field. The tactical signature was unambiguous. Walker, you just come out of a firefight. Sir. Ethan said it quietly. Not aggressively, just a line in the ground. I know what a chance contact looks like. I know what a deliberate ambush looks like. And I know what it looks like when an ambush has been prepared against a specific target at a specific time and location. He paused. There was also a direct attempt on the Overwatch team before the main assault began, from the north, from above and behind a position that wasn't in the standard mission distribution. Vale looked at him steadily. That position was on the planning annex, Ethan said, the one that went through operations staff before distribution. The room had gone very quiet. The other personnel at their stations were not looking at the conversation, which meant they were listening to it. You should be in medical, Vale said. You've been in the field for... I'm fine, sir. That's not a request, Walker. I'm going to file a formal incident report citing compromised operational security as a primary factor in the Keros Ridge assault. Ethan kept his voice level, full in his eyes on Vale's face, and he watched the face while he said it. I wanted you to know that before I did it. He watched Vale's face. There it was again. That fraction of a second, that flash of something beneath the surface of the practiced expression. It was there and it was gone, and anyone who wasn't looking for it would have missed it entirely. Ethan had been looking for it. That's your prerogative, Vale said, and I support full transparency on any OPSEC concerns. But I want to caution you, making allegations without evidence can have consequences for... We recovered a communications device from the Valley, Ethan said, from the man running the relay for the remote operator. It's with our signals team now. Vale said nothing. Early read suggests encrypted traffic from a routing number that intelligence can probably untangle in a few hours. This was not entirely true. The device existed. He'd had Diaz pull it before the team boarded the bird, but they hadn't run a signals analysis yet. Ethan was reading the room and adjusting, which was something Webb had once called creative truthfulness, and which Ethan thought of as operational flexibility. I thought you should know the status of the evidence. The word evidence sat in the air between them. Vale said, I think we should take this to a private setting. I think we should bring it to the XO. Walker, or the CID if you prefer to go that route directly. Ethan looked at him without blinking. I'm flexible on the venue. Vale's face had become very still. That was information too. I'm going to medical to check on my team, Ethan said. I'll file the incident report from there. He turned for the door. Sir? He didn't look back. The medical station was 3 buildings east, a prefab structure with 2 examination rooms and a 4-bed recovery ward that always smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. Daniel Reed was on one of the beds with an IV in his arm and a fresh shoulder dressing and the specific glassy look of someone who'd been given something for the pain and wasn't fighting it. Maya was in the chair beside him, not hooked to anything, not on a bed, having apparently declined the suggestion that she might want to lie down. She looked up when Ethan came in. He pulled a second chair over and sat across from both of them. How is he asked, meaning Daniel. Stable, Daniel said, meaning himself. The medic says the muscle damage is significant, but no nerve involvement, 6 to 8 weeks. Could have been worse. Yeah, it could have been. Daniel looked at the ceiling. It was a suppressed 308 from a sniper, not a spotter. You identified the caliber from the wound? From the sound and the entry angle. It was a trained shooter. It wasn't a ranging shot. They were aiming for kill placement and missed by about 3 inches. Ethan looked at Maya. He identified it while I was packing the wound, she said. In the dark, with a headlamp. I was trying to be helpful, Daniel said. He's always like this, Maya told Ethan. Good to know. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Tell me about the shot. Everything you remember. Daniel told him. He told it the way someone told something they'd been turning over in their head for hours. Not in order, but in the order of importance. The direction of the shot. The lack of warning. The fact that it came from a position above and behind their hide, requiring prior knowledge. The timing. 18 minutes before the main assault on the compound, which meant the shooter had been in position and waiting. Two-man op, Maya said when Daniel finished. The shooter and whoever directed him to our position. Or gave coordinates to whoever directed him, Ethan said. The planner, she said. Not the shooter. Ethan nodded. He pulled out his notebook. A physical notebook. Small, waterproof. The kind that field officers had been keeping since before electronics, and made notes. Then he looked up. Your record, Collins. Tell me about it. She looked at him for a moment. Why? Because someone decided you were the biggest threat to this operation. Not just an obstacle, the specific person who needed to be eliminated before the mission began. That suggests someone knew your capability profile. She said nothing for a moment. Afghanistan, first tour, she said finally. I was in an observation post that got overrun. The rest of my team extracted. I stayed back to cover them. I was on the position alone for 4 hours before the QRF reached me. She paused. That was in my file. And after that they added me to the sniper program. I was the first woman to complete the full qualification at my installation. That's also in my file. She said it without inflection. Not proud, not resentful, just factual. I'm guessing whoever read my file understood what a qualified long-range shooter in an elevated overwatch position would mean for an ambush that depended on the element of surprise. Ethan wrote something. So they planned for you specifically. They planned to remove me specifically. There's a difference. She looked at her hands. It didn't work. No, he said. It didn't. Daniel shifted on the bed and said, ow, in the understated way of someone trying to move a shoulder that didn't want to be moved. Maya's hand went to his forearm automatically. Just for a second. She took it back. Ethan noticed. He said nothing about it. The communications device we recovered, he said. Diaz is running a preliminary analysis now. What I told Vale about the routing, that was partly speculation to see how he reacted. Maya looked at him. And? He reacted. She let out a breath. Will it hold? That depends on what the device actually contains. If there's routing data that matches a number tied to the operations center. He stopped. It won't be fast. CID has a process. Vale will try to get ahead of it. Yes. He has a head start. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the mission file. Who else had access to the planning annex? Ethan looked at his notebook. Vale signed off on the final distribution. Before that, 3 operations staff members processed it through the system. One of them is Vale's direct aide. So the leak was Vale, or someone he controlled. Or someone who controlled him. We don't know the full shape of it yet. He closed the notebook. But we know the shape of this end of it. Daniel had his eyes closed. His breathing had evened out into something close to sleep, which meant the medication had found its level. Maya watched him for a moment. He's going to be fine, Ethan said. I know. She said it like she'd been saying it to herself for hours and was still working on fully believing it. You stayed, Ethan said. On the mountain, when you could have... I couldn't. You could have. You'd done what you could. Reed was stable. The team was... I couldn't, she said again, and the way she said it closed the door on the conversation without being unkind about it. Ethan accepted that. He stood up. His legs registered what the last 7 hours had cost them. A deep physical complaint that he filed under deal with later, which was where it would stay until the adrenaline finished metabolizing and the bill came due. He'd been doing this long enough to know the bill always came due. Get some rest, he said. Both of you. When Diaz finishes the preliminary signals read, you're going to want to be coherent. What are you going to do? Maya asked. Write the incident report. He moved toward the door, stopped. Collins. She looked at him. 17 confirmed, he said. From a position they'd been hunting for 2 hours. Alone. After your spotter was hit. She looked back at him steadily. Her expression was the particular expression of someone who was tired in the specific way that exhaustion had gone through the body and settled somewhere deeper and more permanent. 18, she said. You missed the first one, before the firefight started, the relay runner. He stood there for a moment. 18, he said. Nobody counts the ones they don't know about, she said. But they happened. He left. The incident report took 2 hours. Ethan wrote it in one of the small briefing rooms attached to the operations building, at a table with his notebook and a laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold before he remembered it. He wrote it in the careful, specific language of formal military documentation. No speculation, no inference, no emotional freight. Facts, times, coordinates, radio transmissions, tactical observations. The timeline of the assault and its pre-staged nature. The shot on the Overwatch team from the north, direction, timing, placement, implications. The relay communication system recovered from the valley, the name on the planning annex distribution signature. He read it back when he finished. He hadn't written it to convince anyone of anything. He'd written it to create a record that existed regardless of what happened next. Records were harder to make disappear than conversations. He submitted it through the formal reporting chain at 124 hours. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling. Webb knocked on the open door. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which meant he'd checked whether the first one was still warm and made the correct inference. He set 1 cup in front of Ethan and dropped into the opposite chair. Reports in? Webb asked. Yeah. Vale's been in 3 meetings since you talked to him this morning, 2 of them with the XO. Ethan looked at him. How do you know that? Reese has been watching the ops building. I asked him to. Webb looked entirely unapologetic. He's also getting ahead of you with the XO, framing it as post-incident stress leading to unfounded allegations. The standard move when someone accuses someone above them of something they actually did. Ethan picked up the coffee. Then we need the device. Diaz has something. He put the coffee down. What? Preliminary only, he's not done. But the relay device, it's got partial routing logs that survived the round you put through it. Webb leaned forward. The routing shows 3 separate transmissions during the firefight, all originating from a number that Diaz traced to a field communications unit registered to... He stopped. Say it. Webb looked at him. Operations section, Dewari FOB. Assigned equipment. The room was quiet. That's not the same as Vale, Ethan said. No, it's 1 step removed. It's the operations section's equipment, which doesn't prove individual use, but it narrows the field from the whole world to about 6 people. Webb sat back. CID is going to need to work it. CID is going to take weeks. Yeah. And in the meantime, Vale is building his version of events with the XO. Yeah. Ethan stared at the table. Then he thought about something. Reed, he said. Daniel Reed. He identified the caliber from the wound and the shot direction and the timing. He was a trained spotter. He spent 3 hours alone in a hide with a packed shoulder wound and nothing to do but run through what had happened and what it meant. Webb waited. He had a radio, Ethan said. The secondary one. Maya gave it to him when she left him in the hide. Did he transmit? He couldn't raise anyone, but a radio that can't transmit can still receive. He was listening to frequencies for 3 hours. Ethan looked at Webb. If the remote operator was still communicating with the valley after the initial jamming window, if they shifted to a different frequency to avoid interception, Webb was already standing. Reed, he said. Yeah. They went back to medical. Daniel was not entirely asleep. He had that half-conscious quality of someone the medication had taken to the edge of sleep without quite pushing them over. And when Ethan came in, he opened his eyes with the reasonable speed of someone whose brain was still working, even if the rest of him wasn't. Maya was still in the chair. She looked at both of them when they came in and read their faces. What? She said. Reed. Ethan crouched beside the bed. Your secondary radio, the one Maya left with you in the hide. Were you monitoring? Yeah. Which frequencies? The standard Overwatch net. His voice was slightly blurred at the edges. Command frequency. Emergency. And I scanned a few others when those stayed quiet. He paused. I had time. Did you pick up anything? Daniel was quiet for a moment. His eyes went somewhere else. Back to the hide, 3 hours on a mountain with a packed shoulder and a radio and the sound of gunfire in the valley below him. At around 0430, he said, I picked up a burst transmission on a frequency that's not standard, not one of ours. It was short, maybe 8 seconds. Encrypted, I couldn't decode it, but I noted the frequency. He looked at Ethan. I thought I was just picking up background traffic. I wrote it down. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform shirt, which was still on him, still field dirty, and produced a small notepad. He opened it to the last page. A frequency. A timestamp. And below it, in Daniel Reed's precise small handwriting, a partial note. Non-standard. Burst transmission. 4x repeat at 12-minute intervals. Source direction. West-southwest from my position. West-southwest from the hide on the north slope of Karos Ridge. West-southwest was the direction of Dewari FOB. Daniel handed the notepad to Ethan. His hand was steady despite everything. I didn't know if it meant anything, Daniel said. Ethan looked at the notepad. He looked at Webb. Webb looked back at him with the expression of a man who had seen enough of these moments to know when the shape of a thing finally became clear. It means something, Ethan said. Maya was watching from her chair. She'd gone very still. The particular stillness of someone who has been doing their job in isolation for so long that the moment other people show up carrying the same weight feels slightly unreal. She looked at Daniel's notepad in Ethan's hand. She looked at Ethan's face. That's enough for CID to work from, she said, combined with the device routing. Combined with the incident report, Ethan said, and your testimony. Both of yours. Daniel Reed looked at the ceiling. I'll testify, he said simply, like it wasn't even a question worth considering. Whatever they need. Maya said nothing, but she didn't have to. The thing about evidence was that it was patient. It sat in the world and it waited. And the people who'd created the situation it documented usually spent their time doing the opposite of waiting, moving fast, talking fast, building cover fast. And all that motion eventually ran up against something that didn't move. A frequency notation in a spotter's field notepad. A communications device with partial routing logs. An incident report filed through formal channels at 124 hours. The morning light came through the single window of the recovery ward and lay across the floor in a flat rectangle. And outside the prefab walls, the forward operating base went about its day. Vehicles, voices, the mechanical sounds of a military installation doing what military installations do. And in the chair next to a hospital bed, Staff Sergeant Maya Collins sat with her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular and waited for the next thing to begin. The next thing began 47 minutes later when CID showed up. Two of them, a warrant officer named Gaines and a special agent named Tran, no relation to Ethan's petty officer Tran, who introduced themselves with the particular economy of people who'd learned that long introductions created expectations they didn't want to manage. Gaines was older, with the patient face of someone who'd seen enough investigations to know that the first version of any story was rarely the last. Tran was younger and took notes on a tablet with the focused attention of someone who'd been told early in their career that the details that seemed unimportant were usually the ones that mattered. They set up in the briefing room Ethan had used to write the incident report, and they talked to him for 90 minutes. Then they talked to Webb for 40. Then they came to medical and talked to Maya for an hour and 20 minutes, and to Daniel for 50. And they took Daniel's notepad, photographed it first, then took the original, and they left with the communications device that Diaz had been analyzing and with a copy of the incident report and with something in their manner that was different from how they'd arrived. Not urgency exactly, more like the contained focus of people who'd gone into a room expecting a routine post-incident review and come out of it carrying something heavier. Gaines stopped in the doorway on his way out and looked at Maya. The frequency notation, he said. Your spotter wrote that down while he was wounded, alone, in a field hide, in the dark. He's thorough, Maya said. Gaines looked at the notepad in the evidence bag in his hand. Yeah, he said. He didn't say anything else. He left. Vale was pulled from operational duties at 1400 hours. Nobody announced it. It happened in the way that these things happened in military environments, quietly, through administrative channels, with language that was technically neutral and practically unmistakable. His access credentials were suspended. His aide was interviewed. The two operations staff members who'd processed the mission planning annex were asked to remain available, Ethan heard about it from Webb, who heard about it from Reese, who had been watching the operations building all morning with the dedicated patience of a man who'd decided that this particular thing was worth watching. He didn't see it coming, Webb said, or he knew it was coming and thought he had more time. He had more time than he deserved, Ethan said. Most people like that do. They were sitting outside the medical building in the particular exhausted stillness of people who'd been operating for too long and hadn't quite come down yet. The afternoon sun was hitting the blast walls at an angle that made them look almost warm, which was an illusion the desert was good at creating. "The XO talked to me an hour ago," Ethan said. "What did he say?" "He said the incident report was well documented and that CID would handle it from here and that I should get medical evaluation." He paused. "He also said that the extraction being delayed on my end, staying behind in the valley, was going to require an explanation in the after action. Because you disobeyed the extraction order." "Because I disobeyed the extraction order." Webb was quiet for a moment. And I told him I'd write up exactly what happened and exactly why, and that he could evaluate my decision-making with full information. "What did he say to that?" "He said he'd read it." Ethan looked at the blast wall. "He also told me Collins and Reed were being cited for their conduct during the operation. Formally. Which means someone above the XO already knows the shape of this and wants the record to reflect it correctly." Webb turned to look at him. "Cited how?" He didn't specify, but cited formally in this context means it goes in their service records as a significant action. Webb stared at the wall for a moment. Then he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like a long exhale that had been waiting to happen since about 0200. "She's going to hate that." "Probably. She doesn't seem like someone who wants the attention." "She's not." Ethan stood up slowly, registering every joint in the process. "She's someone who did the job because the job needed doing, whether anyone was watching." Maya was not in the recovery ward when Ethan went back inside. Daniel was sleeping properly now, deeply, the medicated sleep of someone whose body had finally convinced the rest of him to stand down. His face in sleep was younger than it was awake, which was usually the case with people who'd been carrying something difficult. One of the medical staff pointed Ethan toward the building's rear exit. Maya was sitting on an ammunition crate against the back wall of the building, facing east, where the mountain range that contained Keros Ridge was visible as a gray-brown line against the sky. She still had her field uniform on. She'd cleaned her face, but her hands had grime in the creases that didn't come out, without more effort than she'd been willing to spend. She was looking at the mountains. Ethan sat down on a second crate and didn't say anything for a moment. "CID seems competent," she said finally. "Gaines has been doing this for 16 years. He worked a contract fraud case that brought down a battalion commander. He knows how to follow a thread. Vale is going to have lawyers by tonight. Yes, this takes months, probably longer." He looked at the mountains with her. "That bother you?" She thought about it genuinely, which he appreciated. "No," she said. "It bothers me that it happened. The months, that's just process." She paused. "What bothers me is that someone in a command position looked at a mission with 8 people's lives in it and made a decision to sell it. And the thing is, he probably told himself a story about it, that it wasn't really those people specifically, that it was just..." She stopped. "I don't know. Abstract enough that he could live with it. People are good at that, yeah." She picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it in her fingers. "Daniel's going to be out for 6 to 8 weeks. I heard. He'll fight it. He'll try to report back at 4. Let me guess. He'll make 5. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. 5.5. He's stubborn, but he's not reckless. Good qualities. In a spotter, yeah." She set the stone down on the crate beside her. "The XO's office told me about the citation." "When?" 20 minutes ago. Someone called down." She said it without any particular expression, which was itself an expression. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it. It just goes in your record." "I've had things go in my record before. Usually they come with complications." Ethan looked at her. "What kind of complications?" She was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, considering how to answer it honestly. "After Afghanistan, the OP that got overrun." I stayed back and covered the extraction, and the QRF pulled me out and everyone called it exceptional, and I got a commendation." She paused. "And then for the next 14 months, every operational assignment I submitted for came back with a reason it wasn't the right fit. Not denied, just deferred, redirected. Because apparently the people who put commendations in your file and the people who make assignment decisions are not always the same people and don't always read each other's work." Ethan heard what she was saying. "You think the citation creates the same problem? I think being visible creates a certain kind of problem when you're the first woman in a particular slot and some of the people above you are still deciding how they feel about that fact." She looked at the mountains. "I'm not complaining about it. I'm just accurately describing the environment. The environment changes. Slowly. Yeah." He couldn't argue with that. Slowly. They sat with that for a moment. "What happens to your team?" she asked. "Stand down for assessment. Kowalski needs surgery on the shoulder. Garza's leg is going to keep him off operations for 6 weeks minimum. The rest of us," he considered it, "will be evaluated. The after-action will be thorough." "Are you worried about it?" He thought about the decision to stay in the valley, about the XO's face when they talked, about the incident report and what it said about his judgment in a situation that was, by any standard, far outside normal parameters. "Some," he said, "but I'd make the same calls. Even staying in the valley. Especially that one." Maya looked at him for the first time since he'd sat down. It was the look of someone recalibrating a category. Not dramatic, just a quiet adjustment to a prior assessment. "You didn't know me," she said. "You didn't know Reed. You missed your extraction window and stayed in a hot valley for a person you'd never met. You saved 8 of my people. That doesn't obligate you to—" "It doesn't obligate me to anything," he said. "I stayed because leaving wasn't something I was able to do. That's the whole explanation." He paused. "Some decisions are just that simple, once you're in them." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the mountains. "I know," she said quietly. The formal investigation into Major Adrian Vale's conduct was opened by CID 48 hours after Ethan filed the incident report. The communications device recovered from the valley yielded routing data that, once decrypted by signals intelligence, traced to a field unit registered to the Dewari FOB operations section. The burst transmission frequency Daniel had noted in his field notepad matched one of the transmission windows in the routing log. Combined with the timeline of the mission planning process, who had access, when, through what channels, the investigation had a coherent thread to pull. Vale's aide, a young sergeant named Polly, who'd processed several mission planning documents under Vale's direction, agreed to cooperate with investigators on day 3. He was 23 years old and had, by all accounts, understood the documents he was processing as normal administrative work until the moment CID sat him down and laid the timeline out in front of him, and he understood what he'd been used for. He cooperated fully and immediately, which was simultaneously the bravest and most self-interested thing he'd done in his service, and probably both at once. The investigation determined that Vale had been running a side arrangement with a regional power broker for 8 months. Not ideology, not coercion, not any of the reasons people usually found for this particular kind of betrayal. Money. A figure that was significant by any standard and obscene relative to what it had been traded for. He'd leaked mission intelligence on 3 separate occasions before Karos Ridge, each time in ways that were ambiguous enough to be explained as operational security failures rather than deliberate compromise. Karos Ridge was the 4th, and it was the one where he'd overreached, ordered the elimination of the Overwatch team, something the previous 3 compromises hadn't required, and that escalation was what created the evidence that couldn't be explained away. He was arrested on day 6. He was in his quarters when they came for him. Gaines, 2 MPs, and the XO himself, who felt the occasion required his presence. By all accounts, Vale said nothing when the charges were read to him. He looked at the floor and he stayed quiet, and he went with them without resistance. And the expression on his face was the expression of someone who'd spent 8 months telling themselves a story and had just reached the place in the story where the story didn't hold anymore. Maya heard about the arrest from Daniel, who heard about it from a nurse who'd heard it from someone in the operations building, which was how information moved in a forward operating base, regardless of what the official communication channels were supposed to be. She was sitting beside his bed when he told her. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention to it. Done, Daniel said. The investigation isn't done, she said. This part of it is. The part that matters to us. She considered that. Yeah. Daniel watched her. They'd been working together for 14 months, and he knew her well enough to know when she was processing something and when she was done, and when she was pretending to be done. This was the first one. You're not relieved, he said. Not an accusation, just an observation. I'm relieved he's arrested. She set the cold coffee down. I'm not. She tried to find it. I keep thinking about the 3 operations before this one. The ones where he leaked information and nothing came back to him because the ambiguity held. What happened in those operations? Whether anyone died in them because of what he passed on. CID will look at that. CID will look at the evidence that exists. The men who died in those operations. She stopped. They don't get undied because the investigation is thorough. Daniel was quiet. I know that's not how it works, she said. I know the answer to what he did isn't that nothing happened. The answer is accountability. That's the answer that's available. She looked at her hands. You keep count, he said. She looked at him. You count everything, he said. Every shot, every outcome. You told Walker 18, not 17, because you don't let the ones nobody noticed disappear. He shifted carefully against the bed. You're doing the same thing with Vale's operations. You're counting the ones nobody's counting. She didn't respond to that directly, but she didn't look away either. It matters, he said. The counting. Someone should. On day 9, Maya and Ethan were both called to a formal debrief with the XO, a lieutenant colonel named Beckett, who had the careful, deliberate manner of someone who'd survived 2 decades in military leadership by treating complexity with patience. The debrief lasted 3 hours. It covered the tactical events of the Karos Ridge operation in chronological sequence, with Maya and Ethan providing accounts that were compared and cross-referenced and occasionally interrupted by Beckett's questions. Precise questions, the kind that were looking for inconsistencies not to catch anyone out, but to build a complete picture. He was thorough. He was fair. He said very little about his own assessments until the end, when he sat back and looked at both of them across the table. The decision to stay in the valley, he said to Ethan, and the decision to go down from the mountain to guide Walker to Specialist Reed. He looked at Maya. Both of those decisions are outside standard protocol. Yes, sir, Ethan said. You want to tell me what was going through your head when you made them? Ethan thought about it. He'd thought about it every day since it happened, in the particular way you thought about decisions that had turned out right, but hadn't been certain when you made them. The standard protocol is right 99% of the time, he said. It's right because it accounts for the variables you can anticipate and produces the best average outcome. But it's not designed for the specific situation. It's designed for the category of situation. He paused. Sergeant Collins was alone on that mountain with 1 round left and a wounded spotter she couldn't reach. No protocol produces a good outcome there, so I used my judgment. Beckett looked at him without expression. Then he looked at Maya. And you? I went down this mountain because if I'd stayed where I was and waited for extraction, Reed would have been alone up there significantly longer. The wound was managed, but he needed to move, altitude, temperature, blood loss over time. I could get to him faster with Walker's help. She paused. And I needed to know he was okay. That was part of it. Beckett looked at her for a moment. Personal attachment to your spotter. Yes, sir. I'm not going to describe it as something more professional than it was. He made a note. He made several notes. Then he closed the folder in front of him and looked at both of them. The citation I authorized for Sergeant Collins and Specialist Reed is in process, he said. Walker, your after action is under review by the command group. The decision to stay in the valley is going to require a formal judgment, and I'm not going to predict what that judgment will be. He paused. What I will tell you is that the incident report you filed, and the specificity of it, and the timing, is the reason this investigation has the shape it has. If that report had been delayed by 12 hours, Vale would have had enough time to build a version of events that would have made the investigation significantly more difficult. Ethan said nothing. That's not a commendation, Beckett said. It's context. Understood, sir. Beckett stood. They both stood. He looked at Maya one more time. First time working with SEALs, he asked. Yes, sir. Impression? She thought about Ethan staying in the valley, about Webb with his arms crossed at the helicopter pad, making no real argument, just making sure the team knew what was happening. About 8 men in a compound who kept their heads under circumstances that had been specifically designed to kill them. "They're good people," she said. Beckett almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Some of them are." Daniel went home 4 weeks later. Not 6, not 8. 4, because the surgeon had cleared him for limited duty, and Daniel's definition of limited duty included everything except heavy lifting and contact sports, and the military medical system. After 2 negotiations that Maya was not present for but heard about in some detail, agreed to a modified return with a mandatory follow-up in 6 weeks. She drove him to the transport terminal. It was early morning, the sun still low and the air still carrying the night's chill. Daniel had a kit bag over his good shoulder and moved with the slightly deliberate quality of someone monitoring their own pain level with clinical attention and declining to complain about the reading. At the terminal entrance, he stopped and turned to her. "You're not coming on this transport," he said. "No, 2 more weeks for me." "What happens in 2 weeks?" "I find out where they're assigning me next." She paused. The citation apparently opened a conversation about the advanced skills program. "There's a slot." He looked at her. "The advanced program means a different assignment." "Yeah." "Means we're probably not paired anymore." "Probably not." He looked at the terminal entrance. He looked at his boots. He looked back at her. 14 months, he said. 14 months, she said. That OP in Sector 7 where the spotter scope fogged up and I had to call adjustments from memory. You were off by 2 mils on the 3rd shot. 2 mils is within acceptable. 2 mils is 2 mils, Daniel. He grinned, which was the first full grin she'd seen on his face since before the mountain. You're going to terrorize whoever they pair you with next. I'm going to hold them to a standard. Same thing. He reached out with his good arm and she took the hand and held it for a moment. Not a hug, because neither of them were that, but something that meant the same thing and required less performance of it. Then he picked up his bag. Hey, she said. He looked back. 2 mils is 2 mils. He laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that came from the part of a person that hadn't been touched by the mountain or the valley or any of it. He walked into the terminal still laughing, and she watched him until the door closed, and then she stood in the early morning outside a transport terminal in a forward operating base and felt the particular specific weight of things ending. Not badly, just ending, the way things did. Ethan Walker's formal review was completed 3 weeks after Karos Ridge. The command group's judgment on his decision to remain in the valley cited the absence of a standing extraction order covering the Overwatch team, the operational circumstances that created the gap, and the outcome of the decision. It was neither a commendation nor a formal reprimand. It was a finding that the decision had been made outside standard protocol in circumstances that standard protocol had not anticipated, and that the outcome was consistent with the values the protocol was designed to serve, which was, in the particular language of military administrative judgment, about as close to you were right as the system was built to say. He read the finding in his quarters and set it on the desk and looked at it for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called his sister, who lived in Portland and had 3 kids and knew almost nothing about what he actually did, and worried about him constantly anyway, and he talked to her for 40 minutes about her kids and her job and the renovation she'd been doing to her kitchen for what was now apparently its 2nd consecutive year. And at the end of the call, she said, "Are you okay?" in the way she always said it, which meant she was asking the real question underneath the question. And he said, "Yeah, I'm okay," in the way he always said it, which was mostly true and also not the entire answer. After he hung up, he sat in the quiet for a while. He thought about the valley. He thought about 30 fighters who'd been waiting. He thought about a Marine on his knees in the open air and an enemy commander who'd had 1 second of absolute certainty about how the night would end. He thought about the rifle shot that came from the mountain and changed everything. He thought about a woman he hadn't known at 0200 hours and knew by 0900 better than some people he'd worked with for years. Not completely, not the whole shape of her, but the part of a person that came out when the options ran out. The part that was left when everything external was stripped away. That part, he knew. Maya got the advanced program slot. The orders came on a Tuesday, and she read them twice in the way you read things you've wanted enough to be uncertain about when they arrived. The program was stateside, 8 weeks, after which the assignment options expanded in ways her current slot didn't allow. She'd be working with a different team, different mission profile, different everything. She packed her kit that evening and sat on the edge of her bunk in the shared quarters she'd occupied for the last 6 weeks and looked at the wall. Her rifle was field stripped on the desk. She'd been cleaning it, not because it needed cleaning, but because it was what her hands did when her head was busy. She reassembled it now without looking, by feel, the way you did things you'd done enough times that the body remembered without being asked. She thought about the mountain. She thought about looking through the scope at 30 fighters who thought they'd already won, and making the decision in 3 seconds that changed the next 4 hours of 6 people's lives, and her own, and the nights. The decision to fire, the decision to stay, the decision to go down when Ethan asked her to guide him. None of those decisions had felt like decisions, exactly. They'd felt like recognitions. The way a next step felt when you were moving through dark terrain you'd prepared for. Not certain, but oriented. Someone knocked on the doorframe. She looked up. Ethan Walker was in the doorway in off-duty clothes. Civilian shirt, cargo pants, the slightly unfamiliar look of a person in the wrong uniform. He had 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. She took it. He leaned against the doorframe. He didn't come in. Orders? Tuesday. The advanced program? Yeah. He looked at the rifle on the desk. You were cleaning it. I'm always cleaning it. Even when it doesn't need it? Especially then. She wrapped her hands around the cup. You? 2 weeks. The team's reconstituting. Kowalski's back in 4 months. Garza in 6. He paused. They're assigning a new member, someone from the West Coast team. Is Webb happy about it? Webb is never happy about anything he didn't choose himself. Give him 3 weeks and he'll act like the new guy was his idea. She almost smiled. They were quiet for a moment. The particular comfortable quiet of people who'd been through something together and didn't need to talk about it to know it was still in the room with them. Vale's pretrial is in 6 weeks, Ethan said. CID says the evidence is solid. The routing data, Polly's cooperation, the frequency log. His lawyers are already negotiating. They'll negotiate a long time. Yeah. He looked at the floor. But the record is the record. It doesn't go away. She thought about what Daniel had said, about counting, about the ones nobody counted. Polly, she said. The aide. He didn't know what he was doing. Probably not. He's cooperating. His exposure is limited. He's 23. Yeah. Ethan looked at her. You feel something about that? I feel like 23 is very young to be handed something you don't understand the full weight of by someone who should know better. She paused. And I feel like that's also not an excuse. Both things. Ethan nodded. Both things, he said. She drank the coffee. It was good. Better than anything she'd had from the operations building dispenser, which tasted like it was angry about being coffee. Where'd you get this? She asked. Webb found a French press somewhere. Don't ask how. I won't. Another quiet. When you asked me to guide you up the mountain, she said, and I told you I couldn't leave. Yeah. I want you to know that I understood what you were giving up by staying. He looked at her steadily. I know you knew. And I want you to know it wasn't, I didn't take it for granted. I don't. She paused. I'm not good at saying things like this. You're doing fine. I'm really not. But something in her voice had shifted. Less controlled, more just, present. Nobody's stayed before. In any iteration of this kind of thing. Usually when the window closes, people go through it. Well, he said simply, they shouldn't. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the orders on her bunk, at the rifle on the desk, at the cup in her hands. No, she said. They shouldn't. 6 months later, someone asked Maya Collins, at a training session, a junior sniper working through her first qualification, a young woman who'd been told the program wasn't really a fit for her profile and was trying to understand whether that was true or whether it was something else. Someone asked her how you stayed functional when everything went wrong at once. Maya thought about Karos Ridge, about 30 fighters and 6 rounds, and a man who stayed in a valley when the helicopter left. You focus on what's in front of you, she said. One step, one shot, one decision at a time. The young woman looked at her. And when that's not enough? Maya was quiet for a moment. Then you focus on who you're doing it for, she said, even if they don't know your name, even if they'll never know what it cost. She paused. The work is the same either way, but the reason matters. The reason is what keeps you at the scope when everything in you wants to put the rifle down. The young woman wrote something in her notebook. Maya watched her write it. She thought about Daniel Reed's field notepad, small and precise, and full of things he'd written down in the dark, because he understood that the things nobody recorded were the things that disappeared. She thought about Ethan Walker standing at the edge of a boulder line in a valley that was done with being quiet, looking up at a mountain, waiting. She thought about the cold flat light of early morning on Caros Ridge, and the way the valley had looked from above, all its violence and its noise compressed by distance into something that seemed almost still. It hadn't been still. But she'd been on the mountain, and she'd had the scope, and she'd made the decisions that were available to her, one after another, until the people below her were safe. That was all it had ever been. The most dangerous thing in that valley was never the weapons or the numbers or the plan that someone had spent weeks building. It was the one person who had already decided before the first shot fired that nobody she could reach was going to be left behind. Not because the math worked out, not because the protocol said so, because some things aren't a calculation, they're a choice. And the choice, once made, doesn't ask whether anyone is watching.